They mocked him on national TV. They laughed, pointed, and called him a puppet. To them, J.D. Vance's loyalty wasn't conviction, it was comedy. But 287 families in East Palestine didn't laugh, because they still remember the day he showed up, not for cameras, not for politics, but for them. The day their streets were soaked in chemicals, their homes lined with bottled water, and their hope was wearing boots covered in mud. He didn't say much. He didn't need to, because truth doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just stands there, with you, in silence. And for those families, that was enough. That's why this story isn't about headlines. It's about the quiet moments that the headlines never covered. Some of what you'll see has been dramatized. Names, details, and dialogue shaped to tell a deeper truth. Not everything here happened exactly this way, but the feeling it leaves, that's real. This story was built to explore what still lingers in our towns, in our politics, and in the space between silence and action. So before we judge, before we laugh, let's go back to the day the microphones were off and the boots were muddy. Stay with us. Because in a world full of noise, this is one of those stories that still whispers something true. It took just 17 words to light the match. President Trump has done more than any person in my lifetime. I'm proud to stand beside him. The tweet hit the internet at 7:43 a.m. Eastern Time. By 8:06, it was on every screen across the Beltway. By 8:15, they were already laughing. The backlash wasn't just political, it was personal. Anchors raised their eyebrows in performative disbelief. Cable news panels clipped the tweet apart like surgeons with a scalpel, cutting, twisting, repackaging it into an indictment of character. "Is this a joke?" one host asked, smiling into the camera. "Proud to stand beside Trump? I guess J.D. Vance wants a spot on the next season of The Apprentice." Cue the canned laughter. Preloaded, programmed, predictable, but it still stung. Within 20 minutes, late-night shows rolled throwback footage of J.D. criticizing Trump back in 2016. Old clips, grainy, convenient. They didn't care that the world had changed. They didn't care that J.D. had changed. What mattered was that he had stepped out of line. Again. And Washington never forgot. Phones vibrated. Emails exploded. "Senator, are you prepared to clarify? Do you want us to soften the language? CNN is preparing a full segment tonight. Should we get ahead of it?" His aides were trying to contain a leak that hadn't even started dripping yet, but J.D. just stood there, hands in his pockets, eyes fixed on a spot just beyond the horizon outside his office window. He hadn't moved since the moment he pressed send. He didn't look panicked. He didn't even look surprised. He looked tired. Not the kind of tired that came from lack of sleep, but the kind that came from carrying too much truth in a world that only wanted headlines. The room was full of noise, voices layered on voices, spinning, strategizing, trying to dress the statement up in PR armor. But J.D.'s voice cut through them all when he finally spoke, quietly, almost to himself. "They don't remember that day." The room froze. "What day, sir?" an aide asked cautiously. J.D. didn't answer. He just kept looking out that window, his eyes glassy but sharp, like he was watching a reel only he could see. Something unsaid flickered there. Something old. Something that didn't fit neatly into a press release or talking point. But it wasn't just about that tweet. It wasn't just about Trump. It was about why he tweeted it. What moment had carved those words so deeply into him that he'd say them knowing full well the firestorm they'd unleash? Was it loyalty? Was it strategy? Or was it something more inconvenient, like memory? The kind of memory that wasn't televised, that no one ever covered. The kind that hurt quietly because it never got its microphone. In the background, news tickers kept scrolling. J.D. Vance praises Trump in stunning tweet. Senate aides scramble after controversial comment. Is this the end of J.D. Vance's independence? But J.D. didn't flinch. Not at the noise, not at the labels. Because in his mind, he wasn't thinking about votes. He was thinking about boots covered in mud. About a small town no one visited. About a man who had stood beside him, not with a speech but with presence. And when the world demanded, "Explain yourself," he was already planning how to answer. Not with another tweet, Not with another interview, but with a truth they'd tried to bury. The voices didn't stop after the morning news. By nightfall, the echo chamber had become a chorus. Clips of JD's tweet appeared on every major network, each adding its own flavor of sarcasm. On one channel, a political roundtable debated whether he'd lost touch with reality. On another, a comedian leaned back smugly in his chair and delivered the line that would go viral by midnight. J.D. Vance is auditioning for the new reality TV hit, The Apprentice, Senate Edition. The studio audience roared, not politely, not nervously, but the kind of full-bodied laughter that feeds off mockery. It didn't matter that most of them couldn't point out East Palestine on a map. It didn't matter that none of them had been there. In the middle of that noise, JD's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. He looked at the screen. A message from his son. Just one sentence. "Dad, why is everyone laughing at you?" He stared at the words longer than he should have. The boy was 14, too smart to be sheltered, but too young to carry the weight of public shame. JD picked up the phone but didn't reply. What could he say that wouldn't make it worse? That sometimes the world laughs at things it doesn't understand? That standing still in a storm often makes more noise than running with it? He slid the phone into his pocket, walked out of the kitchen, down the hallway, and into the garage. The lights flickered to life above a cluttered workbench, half-finished shelves, a tangle of old cords and memory. There was a cabinet in the corner, not locked, just closed. He opened it and pulled out a large cardboard box marked in thick black Sharpie, East Palestine, February. The box was heavier than he remembered. Inside, loose papers, handwritten notes, a crumpled town map with emergency zones circled in red, a plastic ID badge, a dusty bottle of water with a faded relief stamp on the label, and at the bottom, wrapped in an old dish towel, a photo. It wasn't framed. It hadn't been posted online, but it was there. A grainy print, slightly bent at the corners, soft from time. JD studied it in silence. Two men, a truck stop, a long folding table loaded with canned food and jugs of water, and mud. So much mud. One of the men was him, younger looking, even though it was just a year ago. The other was a familiar figure, wearing a windbreaker, gloves, and no expression for the camera. Because there wasn't one. No reporters, no microphones, no statements. Just sleeves rolled and boots sunk into brown slush. JD ran his thumb across the edge of the photo. People could say what they wanted. They could spin, mock, edit clips for views. But they weren't there that day. They didn't smell the chemical sting in the air. They didn't hear the quiet way those residents spoke, like their pain had long since outgrown their hope. And they didn't see the man next to him lift those boxes like they weighed nothing, say nothing, and leave without a press conference. He didn't need to explain the tweet, because the explanation was sitting in his hands. And as the laughter roared through the screens across America, J.D. Vance stood alone in his garage, holding a memory no camera had captured, but one that refused to fade. Outside, the wind picked up. Inside, something steadier was building. Not rage, not shame, but the calm resolve of a man who knew. The real story hadn't even started yet. He stared at the photo longer than he meant to. The corners were worn, the colors faded, but the moment it captured, that stayed sharp. They had arrived without warning. No sirens, no press release. The governor didn't even know they were coming. It was the morning after the spill, and the town still smelled like melted plastic and rusted metal. Smoke lingered low over the roads like a memory no one wanted but couldn't escape. And then, out of nowhere, a plain black SUV pulled up next to the parking lot behind the Dollar General. Doors opened. A few men stepped out. And then, Trump, followed by JD, both in boots, both quiet, neither of them looking for a camera, because there weren't any. That was the whole point. The town hadn't seen many visits in years, especially not from people like that. People in Washington usually sent statements, not shoulders. But here they were, and there was work to do. Pallets of bottled water had been stacked in the back of a volunteer van. JD didn't hesitate. He walked over, rolled up his sleeves, and started moving crates with the others. One of the locals, and a high school senior with a cracked phone and a shaky hand, took a photo. It wasn't meant for likes. He just wanted to prove to his dad that someone had shown up. The photo came out blurry, grainy even, but you could still see what mattered. Trump's boots were sunk deep into the mud, his cuff stained just above the ankle. JD was next to him, halfway turned toward a man holding a clipboard. Neither of them was speaking. It looked more like a moment caught between orders than something posed. There was no podium, no crowd, just tired eyes, heavy air, and wet ground. JD remembered that morning clearly because no one had been looking. That was the difference. It wasn't about saying the right thing. It was about being there when nothing was expected. The people unloading boxes weren't thinking about politics. They were thinking about cancer clusters, about pets that wouldn't stop vomiting, about children too scared to drink from the tap. They didn't need promises. They needed presence. That day they got both. Back in the garage, JD slowly set the photo down on the workbench. His thumb lingered near the blurred corner, where his own silhouette leaned forward into the frame, bent beneath the weight of a 24-pack of water bottles. He looked younger then, not because his face had fewer lines, but because he hadn't yet learned how loud the world could get when it didn't want to remember. Outside, the wind scraped gently against the metal siding of the garage. Somewhere in the distance, a crow called once, sharp and dry. JD exhaled slowly and whispered into the stillness. They laughed too soon. It wasn't bitterness. It was certainty. He walked out of the garage, leaving the box open on the table. The photo sat atop the pile now, no longer hidden, no longer wrapped. As he reached for the door, he glanced back once. The past was sitting there, waiting, not asking for redemption, just not willing to be erased. And the thing about memory, the real kind, it doesn't go viral. It just waits until someone finally holds it up and says, "Look again." The photo stayed on the bench, but its weight followed him home. JD didn't say anything during the drive. Not to the aide who called with a second round of media quotes. Not to the volunteer who asked if he'd seen the trending hashtags. He just nodded politely, then closed the car door behind him, like sealing off a vault. At home, the television was already on. His wife had left it tuned to a late-night show she usually didn't watch. Background noise, something to fill the quiet while dinner simmered. But tonight the volume was up, and they were talking about him. A split screen of JD's tweet floated on the screen behind the host, blown up in bold font. The man stood center stage, suit crisp, smile razor sharp. "Now let's read this carefully," he said, dragging the words for effect. "President Trump has done more than any person in my lifetime." He looked up and smirked. "Now, folks, either JD Vance was born in 2016, or he's just hoping to get cast in The Apprentice, Senate edition." The studio audience roared, on cue, like they'd been waiting all night for that line. He milked the moment, walking in slow circles, hands open like a preacher mid-sermon. "I mean, this guy went from never Trump to never stop praising in record time. Give him an Emmy, or at least a red tie and a spray tan." More laughter. Another wave. The camera panned to people clapping, some with tears of mirth in their eyes. They weren't laughing at a joke. They were laughing at him. JD didn't flinch. He just stood there in his living room, eyes fixed on the screen like he wasn't watching a show, but a warning. His body still, except for one hand that slowly reached for the remote. Click. Silence. The laughter stopped mid-echo. The room dimmed, as if something inside it had shut down along with the screen. Behind him, his wife dried her hands on a kitchen towel and leaned quietly against the doorway. "Are you going to respond?" she asked. He didn't turn to look at her, not because he was angry, but because he wasn't. Not anymore. Not surprised, not wounded, not even defensive. He just said, low and even, "Not with words." She waited, letting the silence breathe. JD stepped away from the TV and into the hallway. Every step felt heavier now, like the laughter had soaked into the carpet. It wasn't the insult that stayed with him. It was the ease with which they delivered it. The way truth had become entertainment. How mockery had become currency. He remembered that muddy parking lot, the smell, the weight of the water pallets, the silence of people who had stopped hoping anyone would come. They hadn't laughed, and that's why he wouldn't answer with sound bites. That's why he wouldn't issue a statement or book a rebuttal interview. Because when people are screaming over each other, no one listens. But when someone simply shows up, without flash, without agenda, people remember. Even if the world forgets, especially when it forgets. He passed by a framed map of Ohio on the hallway wall and paused briefly. His eyes traced the shape, then landed on a small dot just below the curve of the river. East Palestine. No bigger than a freckle, but it had left a mark on him. The country could laugh all it wanted, but JD knew what they didn't. Some truths don't echo on stages. They settle in mud, and they stay. He didn't go to bed. After the screen went black and the laughter was gone, JD stood for a moment in the middle of his hallway. Not frozen, just suspended, like he was waiting for something to shift in the air, or for the world to ask a better question than the one it had just laughed over. But nothing came, only silence. So instead of turning off the lights, he made his way down the stairs. The basement office wasn't part of the official house tour. No cameras had ever been invited there. It wasn't styled for press interviews or polished like the rooms upstairs. It was lived in, honest. A low-ceilinged, half-finished space filled with boxes, dusty shelves, and the kind of clutter that only made sense to the person who'd lived the journey. Stacks of old signs leaned against one wall. Campaign logos from 3 runs ago, mismatched fonts, folded American flags from county fairs long past. A rusted folding chair still bore the faded outline of his first town hall, held in a rented church basement during a thunderstorm that had knocked the power out halfway through. He didn't look for any of that. He knew what he needed. In the far corner, behind a file cabinet whose handle no longer worked, there was a gray plastic tub with a crack near the lid. JD tugged it forward, dust trailing from the grooves. On top was a folder labeled in thick black Sharpie. Field correspondence, unsorted. Beneath it, a red manila envelope, worn at the edges, sealed shut with an old brass clasp. 3 words written in faint pen, letters from East Palestine. He paused before opening it, not out of doubt but respect. That envelope held voices, real ones, the kind that didn't make the news or get printed on campaign brochures. He loosened the clasp and let the contents slide gently into his hands. Dozens of folded notes, some typed, most handwritten, blue ink on legal pad paper, torn out notebook scraps, a few stained at the edges from rain or sweat, or maybe something heavier. He began to read. One was from a trucker who'd lost his rig to the toxic spill and wrote, "We didn't expect anyone to show up. You changed that." Another from a mother of 3. "We've been boiled down to statistics for years. You made us human again." But it was the waitress's letter that stopped him. Her handwriting was sharp, upright. No loops, no flourishes. Like someone used to holding herself together. "Thank you for showing up when no one else did," she wrote. "I didn't vote for you. I didn't vote for him. But I remember who came, and I remember who didn't." That line sat heavy. He read it again, slower this time. "I didn't vote for you, but I remember who came." It wasn't praise. It was something purer, memory as testimony. JD leaned back in the old leather chair. The smell of basement, of cardboard and concrete and time, surrounded him like a truth no press cycle could dilute. The envelope lay open on the desk now, its contents spilling forward like a quiet rebellion against the noise upstairs. Above him, the world debated his motives. Below, he held the reason they didn't understand. He didn't need to fight the laughter, because this was the part of the story they never asked to see. He didn't sleep much that night. The letters stayed on his desk long after the basement light should have been switched off. They weren't dramatic. They didn't scream, but they lingered, like the residue of something heavier than paper, something unshakable. By morning, JD had made up his mind. At 7:12 a.m., he walked into his office with coffee in one hand and a quiet conviction in the other. His chief of staff was already there, sorting through a thick binder of weekend media coverage, her expression tight, alert. She looked up when he entered. "I want to go back," JD said. She blinked. "Back where?" "East Palestine." A pause. She tilted her head slightly cautious. "To do what?" "Visit." "Should we schedule press?" No. You want a town hall? No. No stage, no speech, just a visit. Her eyebrows knit. We're in the middle of a national media cycle, Senator. If you disappear now, I'm not disappearing. I'm returning. He said it flatly, but not coldly. Like someone correcting the record, not picking a fight. Another aide stepped in. We can notify local news, maybe coordinate. JD shook his head. No coordination, no statements, just me, and no government car. The room stilled. No one knew quite what to do with that. By afternoon, he'd packed a duffel bag, called a driver to the airport, and booked a commercial flight under his own name. No press corps, no staff trailing behind with folders. Just JD, in jeans and a hooded sweatshirt, blending into a sea of strangers who had no idea he was a sitting U.S. Senator. He boarded the flight in silence. The gate attendant didn't look twice. 2.5 hours later, he touched down in Pittsburgh. Cold air met him as he stepped off the jet bridge. The sky was low and gray, pressing down on the tarmac like it had something to prove. Inside the terminal, he kept his head down. No one recognized him, or if they did, they didn't care. And JD was fine with that. Sometimes anonymity is the only way to hear clearly. He rented a beat-up sedan from a kiosk that smelled like burnt coffee and printer ink. The clerk barely looked up. JD signed the papers, took the keys, and walked out without a word. Once on the road, the silence settled in like an old friend. Route 14 stretched out in front of him. 2-lane, winding, flanked by skeletal trees and shuttered gas stations. Fog crept along the edges of the pavement, rising from frozen fields like breath held too long. His headlights cut through the mist, but barely. Visibility came and went, like memory. The closer he got, the more it felt like time was folding back in on itself. Like the place wasn't just a town. It was a question that had never really been answered. As he drove, he thought of the waitress's letter. I remember who came, and I remember who didn't. He wasn't going to rewrite history. He wasn't even trying to fix it. He just needed to stand in the place again, to smell the air, to feel the ground, to remember the difference between politics and presence, and maybe, just maybe, to remind the people who lived there that memory still mattered, that someone still carried it. He whispered to the empty car, they need to remember, and I need to remind myself. Then he turned down the last stretch of road into the fog, where the headlines had never reached. But the truth had once stood still. He parked just after 10. The fog hadn't lifted. East Palestine didn't look different from how he remembered it. But that was the thing. It hadn't changed much because it hadn't been allowed to. Still the same uneven sidewalks. Still the same hardware store with the hand-painted window sign. Still the same smell in the air. A faint chemical note buried beneath wood smoke and cold earth. JD pulled his hood up tighter against the wind and crossed the street toward the only place that looked open. Lynn's Diner. The windows fogged from inside, yellow light spilling onto the pavement like a quiet invitation. He stepped in and let the door close behind him with a soft chime. The warmth hit his face, familiar. He didn't expect anyone to recognize him, not like this. But he wasn't even 2 steps in when a voice came from behind the counter. I remember you. He turned. The waitress behind the counter didn't need a name tag. JD knew her face instantly. She was older now, or maybe just more tired, but the same eyes, sharp and kind, studied him from across the room. She poured a cup of coffee with one hand and motioned toward a stool with the other. You didn't talk much back then, she added. Most of them do. But you just rolled up your sleeves and went to work? JD smiled faintly and took the seat. I didn't think you'd remember. I don't forget people who show up, she said, setting the cup in front of him. Especially not on a day like that. She leaned on the counter, wiping it slowly with a towel that had seen better years. I brought out coffee, you know. Didn't know who to give it to first. Everyone looked like they hadn't slept in 3 days. Then I saw him, your friend. JD's eyes lifted. Trump, she nodded. Yep, that one. I held out the cup and didn't expect much, but he said thank you like any man would. Didn't even look surprised I offered. Just took it, nodded, and kept unloading crates. There was no awe in her tone, just memory, grounded, unglamorous. real. I think that's what struck me, she continued. He wasn't being a politician that day, and neither were you. You were just people, in the mud, with us. JD didn't answer right away. He let her words settle between them, blending with the sound of an old ceiling fan clicking softly overhead. Outside, a truck rolled past slowly, tires grinding against damp gravel. No one noticed. No one cared. That's how towns like this survived, quietly. The waitress poured herself a cup, took a sip, then gave him a look that cut through the space between present and past. They all come here when it's time to campaign, she said. Cameras, speeches, promises. She shrugged. But I remember the ones who came when nothing was on the line. JD looked down at his hands. A bit older now, a little more worn, the sleeves on his sweatshirt slightly damp from the mist outside. He remembered that day too. Not because of what they said, but because of what no one had to. As he wrapped his hands around the mug, warming his fingers, he thought, this was why he came back, not to talk, to listen, to remember. Because in towns like this, memory wasn't nostalgia, it was currency, and far too many had spent it all just to survive. He was halfway through the coffee when a voice behind him spoke with a careful hush, like someone not used to being heard. Senator. JD turned. A man stood near the entrance, one hand resting on the back of a chair, the other gripping a rolled-up envelope. He looked like someone carved out of Ohio farmland. Weathered, built to last, face full of years and a kind of quiet that couldn't be taught. JD stood to greet him, hand extended. The man nodded once, but didn't shake. I don't mean to interrupt, he said, but I've got something you might want to see. JD tilted his head. I'm listening. The man motioned toward the far end of the diner, where the booths met the frosted windows. Away from ears, away from curiosity. They sat down without a word. The man placed the envelope on the table and slowly unrolled it. Inside was a photograph, not glossy, not staged, just a plain 4x6 print, bent slightly at one corner. The kind you got at gas station developers before the world went digital. I took this the morning after the spill, he said. Didn't plan to, was just fumbling with my phone, hands cold, snapped it before anyone saw. JD's eyes dropped to the image. He didn't speak. There they were, him and Trump. No microphones, no podium, just a parking lot rimmed with mud and plastic pallets stacked shoulder high. JD was hunched over, lifting a box with a volunteer. Trump stood nearby, head down, sleeves already wet. Boots sunk 2 inches deep into slush. No suits, no Secret Service in sight. Just real silence. Captured. The diner seemed to vanish for a moment. JD stared at it like someone seeing his own memory proven real. Not because he doubted it, but because the world had. The man spoke again, his voice low and steady. I showed it to a few people. Back when the network said y'all staged the visit. They said it was political theater, that you never stayed, never touched a thing. He shook his head. No one wanted to believe me. Said if it wasn't trending, it didn't happen. But I kept this. Figured one day it'd matter. JD exhaled through his nose, slow and tight. He ran his finger across the bottom edge of the print, feeling the soft texture of paper against skin. This wasn't a headline. It was the space between them, the space where something human had happened and no one had bothered to ask. This, he said, voice almost a whisper, this is the story they never wanted to tell. The old man nodded. Most stories worth remembering don't make the news. They sat like that for a while. JD didn't ask for the photo, and the man didn't offer it. Some things weren't meant to be owned, just recognized. But before he left the booth, the man slid a second print across the table. A copy. For the record, he said, yours. JD took it and folded it slowly, with care, as if it might tear through time. Outside, the fog was beginning to lift. Not entirely, but enough to see the curve of the street, the outlines of buildings that had stood too long without notice. He slipped the photo into the inner pocket of his coat. It didn't make a sound, but it carried the weight of every silence that came before it. The air outside bit sharper than before. The fog had thinned, but the wind had picked up, curling through the empty alleyways and rattling loose signs on old telephone poles. JD pulled his collar tighter as he stepped off the diner's front steps, the folded photo still tucked safely inside his coat. He didn't walk far before he saw them, a group of teenagers gathered around what used to be the town park. 3 boys, 2 girls, all bundled in mismatched jackets, some wearing gloves without pairs. They were pulling up rotted boards from what had once been a small wooden bridge over a dry drainage creek. Nearby, an old paint bucket and a bag of donated mulch sat waiting. JD approached slowly, not wanting to interrupt. One of the boys, lanky, maybe 17, noticed him first. "You here for the photos or something?" he asked, a little wary, a little amused. JD smiled. "Not today." Another boy looked up from where he was prying up a plank. "You're the senator, right?" JD nodded. "I used to be." That got a few grins. One of the girls shook her head and said, "No offense, but most of you guys only come here when cameras do." JD raised an eyebrow, then gestured around. "See any?" The group chuckled lightly, but there was no malice, just fatigue. The girl stood up straight, brushing dirt off her sleeves. "I was 12 when the spill happened. My little brother threw up for 3 days. Our dog couldn't breathe right for weeks. But on TV, it was just a segment, like it happened somewhere else." Another chimed in, this time with a mixture of frustration and resignation. "All we hear is jokes and noise now, memes, headlines. But no one really came here, except for you guys." JD's voice was quiet when he spoke. That day, it wasn't for headlines, it was for moments like this. They stared at him, curious, not suspicious, just trying to read what kind of man would come back here without a team or a script. He looked around at the park, the broken benches, the peeling paint, the silence between the trees, and then back at them. "You all ever hear what actually happened that day?" he asked. "The day after the spill?" They shrugged. "Bits and pieces," one of them said. "Mostly from parents. But no one teaches it. It's like it barely happened." JD knelt down beside the bridge, picked up a loose nail, turned it slowly between his fingers. "That's the thing about stories," he said. "If you don't tell them loud enough, someone else rewrites them." They didn't respond, but they were listening now. Really listening. He stood, exhaled into the cold, and looked each of them in the eye. "I didn't come back here for attention. I came back because I think I stayed too quiet for too long." A pause. "And that's going to change." The girl with the paint-stained hoodie tilted her head. "You mean like another tweet?" JD smiled, dry but not unkind. "No, something real, something that lasts." She nodded, as if understanding more than she said. "Good, because some of us are still here. We remember." The wind cut through again, rustling branches, carrying voices that had long since faded from headlines. JD turned toward the road, his breath rising in soft white curls. The teens went back to work, quieter now, but lighter somehow. And as he walked, he felt it settle in his chest. Not anger, not even sorrow, but resolve. If the world wouldn't remember East Palestine, then he'd make sure East Palestine remembered itself. And this time, the silence would not be mistaken for absence. The marble halls of Washington didn't feel any warmer than the streets of East Palestine. JD walked into the committee room in the same coat he'd worn 2 days earlier on the fog-wrapped streets of Ohio. The difference was that here, everything gleamed. Polished wood, high ceilings, brass nameplates. Nothing smelled like rust or smoke. Nothing looked broken. But somehow it all felt more hollow. He took his seat quietly, nodding to a few staffers, ignoring the cluster of journalists gathered at the back. The topic of the day: rural crisis response infrastructure, a phrase that sounded urgent in print, but meant almost nothing until you'd stood on mud with no clean water. JD didn't bring a folder of remarks. He didn't even bring talking points. He brought one thing, a photo, folded once, tucked neatly inside the interior pocket of his coat, now resting in his hands. When his name was called, he didn't adjust his mic. He didn't clear his throat. He simply rose, walked to the front of the room, and looked across a line of polished faces. Senators, advisors, bureaucrats. Many of them had never stepped foot outside D.C. in months, maybe years. "I'm not here to debate funding formulas," he began. He unfolded the photo, held it up between both hands. "I'm here to show you something you've never seen because you never wanted to." A ripple passed through the room. Not loud, but real. Some leaned in, others looked down, unsure of what to expect. JD paused for just a moment, then raised the image higher. "This is East Palestine, the morning after the spill." He turned the photo outward. No press, no announcement, no speeches. Just boots in mud, sleeves rolled, boxes moved. His voice stayed low but steady. "You see, we call it a rural crisis response hearing. But what do we mean by crisis? Only the ones that trend? Only the ones we can turn into policy memos and PR wins?" A murmur stirred on the panel. One senator shuffled his notes, glancing at the clerk beside him. JD held the photo like it was a courtroom exhibit. "This isn't a talking point, it's a wound. One this building ignored, and still does." He turned slightly, directing his words not just to the committee, but to the cameras behind them, the ones that were finally watching. "Do you know how many families still drink from plastic jugs delivered by volunteers? Do you know how many kids walk past orange-stained creeks to get to school?" He stepped back. "You ask me why I stood beside someone you consider divisive. Why I praised a man you mock nightly." He tapped the photo lightly with one finger. "Because he stood in this. Silence. Not defensive silence. Not procedural silence. The kind of silence that settles in a room when truth enters without knocking." JD let it sit. Then he folded the photo again, carefully, deliberately, and placed it on the table in front of him. "I yield my time." No one spoke, not right away. A gavel eventually knocked, out of rhythm, but the room never quite returned to its old shape. Not after that. And as JD walked back to his seat, he didn't look back. Because he wasn't trying to impress them. He was trying to remind them what forgetting looks like. The silence didn't last long. That's the thing about Washington. It's allergic to stillness. Even when truth lands hard, someone always feels the need to sweep it away before it settles. This time it came from the other end of the dais, a voice polished by years of power and too many microphones. Senator Adeline Wexler of New York, third-term media darling and proud architect of 3 climate resilience white papers that had never once mentioned East Palestine, adjusted her blazer and leaned forward with a smile sharp enough to cut glass. "Cute photo, Senator," she said, her tone casual but soaked in condescension. "But unfortunately, heroism isn't policy." A few quiet chuckles flickered through the room. One staffer smirked. Another tapped on their phone under the table. JD didn't flinch. He looked at her. Not fast, not defensive. Just directly. The kind of look that didn't blink because it didn't need to. The kind of look that says, "I've already been where you wouldn't go." And then calmly, "You can mock the mud, just don't pretend you stood in it." The laughter died. The panel chair cleared his throat, but didn't interrupt. The air had changed, slightly heavier, as if the room itself didn't know whether to brace or breathe. Wexler tilted her head, maintaining her practiced ease. "Look, I respect what you're trying to say, JD, but anecdotes don't scale, and public memory doesn't write legislation. You of all people should know that." He leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table, voice level. "You're right. Public memory doesn't write legislation, but neither does moral distance." She blinked, not thrown but no longer smiling either. JD continued, "We sit in these chairs and pretend the numbers on a page are just figures. But they're not. They're mothers, grandparents, kids who wake up with headaches they can't explain and water that smells like melted wires." He tapped the folded photo in front of him gently. "You call that heroism. I call it showing up, which, respectfully, is more than this room has done. No theatrics, no shouting, just facts laid bare and left on the table, like tools he didn't need to polish because they already worked." Wexler sat back in her chair. The smirk was gone now, replaced with something harder to read. Not embarrassment, not agreement, just the stillness of someone who hadn't expected resistance from someone so Still, a new senator from Nebraska, younger and less certain, looked between them, then shifted uncomfortably in his seat. No one wanted to take Wexler's side out loud, not now. Not when JD had said what they knew deep down was true, that most of them had never been there and had no intention of going. The committee chair tried to move the conversation along, asking about resource allocation formulas and FEMA response timelines. But the oxygen had shifted, because JD hadn't just made a point. He'd made a choice to bring the mud into the room, to stain the carpets of comfort with a truth that didn't need to scream to be heard. As the hearing wrapped, aides began packing binders and closing laptops. JD remained seated a few seconds longer, fingers resting gently on the photo like it was a reminder, or maybe a warning. And for a brief moment, just long enough to notice, even Senator Wexler didn't look at him. Because deep down, everyone in that room knew, you can dismiss a man, but it's harder to dismiss the dirt still clinging to his boots. The hearing ended, but the aftermath had just begun. By the time JD stepped out of the chamber, a dozen voices were already rising above the marble. Questions flung from behind press ropes, cameras blinking, microphones lifted like spears. Most of them didn't want answers. They wanted reactions. JD kept walking. He made it halfway through the corridor before he heard a different voice, softer, more deliberate. Senator Vance? He turned. A young woman, barely 30, stood with a notepad in hand. Not a phone, not a live stream rig, an actual notepad. Her press badge said Rachel Lynn, Capital Chronicle, a publication small enough to be overlooked, but respected enough to make people in power uncomfortable. I'd like a few minutes, off the record if possible, she said. Her tone was professional, but JD caught the curiosity just beneath it. She wasn't chasing a quote. She was chasing something harder to find. He glanced at her notebook, then at her face. Clear-eyed, sharp, but hesitant, like someone unsure if they were intruding or stepping towards something important. What did you think of the hearing? He asked, folding his hands calmly. She didn't deflect. It was theatrical, she admitted, but not from you. That earned the faintest twitch of a smile from him. And the photo? Rachel hesitated. Real. Maybe too real for a building like this. JD didn't answer right away. Instead, he motioned for her to follow. They stepped into a quieter alcove near a forgotten coat room, away from the swirl of headlines being written in real time. You want to understand what happened in East Palestine, JD said. You can't do it from here. Rachel opened her mouth to respond, but he raised a hand. Don't write what I say, he said. Come to Ohio. See it. Talk to them. Walk the same streets. Smell the air. Then write what you see. Her brow furrowed slightly. You're inviting me to go with you? No entourage, no briefing packet, no escort, just you. And what's left behind? She paused. What's in it for you? JD shrugged. Maybe nothing. Or maybe just one person who stops asking questions long enough to actually listen. It was a strange offer. Unscripted. Too slow for viral news, too quiet for cable. But something in the way he said it, firm, unembellished, made her hesitate. Most politicians want to control the narrative, she said. He gave a half smile. I've stopped trying to win headlines. Now I'm just trying to outlive them. She didn't say yes. Not right then. But she didn't say no either. Instead, she closed her notebook and slipped it back into her satchel. I'll think about it. JD nodded, then added, if you come, leave your questions at the airport. Bring your eyes instead. Rachel held his gaze for a moment longer. Not challenging, but measuring. Then she turned and walked away, her steps light, but slower than before. He didn't watch her go. He simply leaned against the marble wall, folded his arms, and looked down at the boots still crusted with dried Ohio mud, the same boots he hadn't cleaned. On purpose, because sometimes it takes dirt to make things clear. And this story, if she chose to follow it, wouldn't begin in D.C. It would begin where the microphones had stopped working and the memories hadn't. The rec center hadn't changed. The same warped linoleum floors, the same flickering exit light above the rusted double doors. A basketball hoop hung loosely from one wall, its net half detached like it had given up mid-season. Fold-out chairs were scattered across the room, not in rows but in small clusters, like no one wanted to sit too close. There were 23 people in attendance. No camera crews, no microphones, no press tables with notepads and coffee. Just locals, men in work boots, women with tired eyes and folded arms, teenagers pretending not to care, but not leaving either. JD stood near the front. A metal lectern had been dragged out for him, its legs uneven. A thin stack of notes sat atop it, printed, double-spaced, carefully worded. He stared at the first page for a few seconds. Then he folded the whole stack in half and set it aside. He looked up. "I came back because I owe you more than silence," he said. A few heads lifted. No one clapped. He didn't expect them to. "They mocked me in Washington," he continued. "They laughed at me on television, and they'll keep laughing, probably for a while." He paused, scanning the room. Every face was different, but every expression carried the same thing: endurance. "They say I'm foolish for remembering, that I'm loyal to the wrong man, that I'm clinging to something outdated. But let me ask you, when did loyalty become a punchline?" A low murmur rippled across the seats. No big reaction, just the sound of people leaning in. Just a little. JD stepped away from the lectern. His voice was steadier now, less guarded. "You know what I remember," he said. "I remember standing in the mud next to your church parking lot. I remember the smell of burnt plastic in the air. I remember unloading water bottles next to your sons and daughters, not because it was expected, but because it was needed." He let the weight of that hang for a breath. "I remember showing up, and I remember who didn't." Still no clapping, but no one looked away. "I'm not here to change your politics. I'm not here to win you over with slogans. I'm here because you deserve more than a soundbite. You deserve to be seen." A man stood up slowly from the third row. Gray hair, denim jacket, face like tree bark. Tough, real, unmovable. He didn't ask permission to speak. He didn't need to. "They laughed at you," the man said, voice low but firm. "But we still live here." It landed like a thunderclap in a silent storm. JD nodded once, deeply. "That's why I'm back," he said. "Not to explain myself, but to remind people that this place matters." He glanced toward the windows. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting long orange streaks across the rec center floor. "They don't put places like this on postcards, but that doesn't mean you're invisible." He looked back to the crowd. Not a crowd, really. Just a gathering, a community, a room full of people who hadn't left, hadn't forgotten. "I didn't come here to be celebrated," he said. "I came here to listen again." And for the first time that evening, someone clapped. Just once. Then another. Then silence again. But this time the silence wasn't hollow. It was full, with the sound of something quietly returning: respect. The clapping faded. JD let it go. He hadn't come for applause. He was about to step back when a quiet voice pierced the lull. "Can I ask something?" Everyone turned. She stood in the last row, barely 16 by the look of her, in a sweatshirt 2 sizes too big and shoes still caked in dust. Her hair was pulled into a quick ponytail, and her hands clutched a beat-up spiral notebook against her chest. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She just didn't want to leave the room without understanding something. JD gave a small nod. "Of course." The room went still again, but this time the stillness leaned forward. She cleared her throat. "Why didn't the others come?" The others. It wasn't a naive question. It was a clean one. Clean like air after a hard rain. There was no edge to her voice, no accusation. Only the weight of a truth that hadn't yet been softened by cynicism. JD didn't flinch. He'd expected this. Not from a reporter, not from an opponent, but from someone who actually lived with the silence they all claimed to care about. "Because," he said slowly, "they thought you wouldn't notice." He let the words settle. There was no anger in his tone, just a kind of soft finality, like closing a door that had been open too long. The girl blinked, once, twice. Then her shoulders lifted ever so slightly. Her eyes didn't tear, not exactly, but they changed. Like something behind them caught light. Her jaw tightened, not in frustration, but resolve. "I did," she said. 2 words, and they were heavier than any headline. In the corner, an old veteran coughed. Someone near the back folded their arms tighter. The silence shifted again. Not awkward now, but electric. JD felt it roll through the room, unspoken but undeniable. Someone had noticed. JD offered her a half smile. "That's why I came back." The girl sat back down without saying another word, but her gaze never left him. It wasn't admiration, it was expectation. And that hit harder than applause. Because applause fades, expectations linger. JD stepped back toward the lectern. This time he didn't need notes. He didn't need a podium. He just stood there, one hand resting casually on the edge of the table, and looked at the others. "We keep waiting for someone bigger, someone louder, someone more powerful to show up," he said. "But sometimes all it takes to hold a place accountable is one person asking the right question." He looked back toward the girl, and the right person noticing the wrong silence. The girl didn't smile. She didn't nod. She just sat there, like she was measuring everything, storing it deep. As if she already knew that years later, she might be the one standing at a podium, answering the next question that mattered. Outside, the wind had picked up. One of the old windows whined faintly in its frame, like even the building had leaned in to listen. And just before the next speaker took the floor, JD said one last thing. Not loud, not performative, just honest. "We're not forgotten. We were just underestimated." And with that, he stepped down. But in the back of the room, in row 5, seat 2, something had just started. The town hall ended not with applause, but with chairs scraping gently against linoleum and quiet nods exchanged between neighbors. Some lingered to shake JD's hand. Most didn't, but they stayed longer than they had to, and that meant something. JD didn't speak much as he left. Just a few quiet thank yous, a handshake or two. Outside, the wind was colder than earlier. Evening had settled in like a coat he hadn't expected to wear. His truck was parked at the edge of the lot, beneath the only working street lamp. The light buzzed faintly above him as he approached, hands in his jacket pockets, mind still inside that room. He noticed it just before opening the door. A folded piece of lined notebook paper, weighted beneath the wiper blade. He plucked it carefully, unfolded it slowly like it might vanish if handled too fast. In scrawled handwriting, all caps, no signature. "This place remembers who stood with it. Thank you." That was it. No name, no ask, just truth. JD stood still for a long moment, the note trembling lightly in his hands from the wind. There were no cameras, no reporters, no curated responses or media playbooks. Just 8 words written by someone who saw, who remembered, and who cared enough to say it. He walked to the passenger side, opened the glove compartment, and pulled out an old envelope. It had once held briefing notes for a Senate hearing. Now it held something far more lasting. Inside were 2 things. The printed photo, the one taken the day after the spill, muddy boots, rolled sleeves, a moment the world never aired. And now this note. JD folded the paper carefully, slid it inside, and sealed the flap shut like it was the last page of a chapter he wasn't ready to forget. He sat in the cab for a few minutes before starting the engine. No music, no radio, just the hum of the heater and the low rumble of memory. In the rearview mirror, the rec center stood quiet, lights dimming. It would host a bake sale next week, maybe a bingo night. Nothing that would make the news. But the people inside would remember this night, not because JD Vance spoke, but because someone asked why, and someone else answered with silence and a note. He pulled out of the lot slowly, tires crunching over gravel. As the building faded from view, JD whispered into the dark cab. Not to anyone, just to the night itself. They thought the town forgot. His eyes flicked to the sealed envelope on the passenger seat, its edges glowing faintly under the dashboard light. But the town remembers. And for the first time since the tweet, since the laughter, since the hearing, he smiled. Not wide, not triumphant, just enough to carry him down the road, past the fog, and into what came next. 3 days after JD left East Palestine, a manila envelope arrived at his Senate office. No return address. No staffer flagged it urgent. It had been tossed casually into the daily stack of mail, buried beneath policy reports and scheduled statements. But something about the envelope, its weight, the smudged ink, the slightly torn corner, caught JD's attention. He peeled it open slowly, like he'd done with the note on his windshield. Inside was a letter, 5 handwritten pages on lined paper, folded carefully, neat cursive, faded blue ink. At the top, from a widow in West Virginia. JD sat down without a word and began to read. Senator Vance, my husband Malcolm, was a Navy vet. He served 22 years, came home proud, and spent the next 2 decades getting slowly forgotten. The last year was the worst. The VA delays broke something in him. He didn't ask for much. Just for someone to answer the phone, return a form, remember his name. When the order came through from President Trump to speed up regional care, suddenly, for the first time in months, he got an appointment within a week. They couldn't undo the cancer, but they gave him one last month without pain. That was the month I got to hear him sing again. That was the month our granddaughter got to show him her drawings. That was the month he told me, I feel seen again. JD paused there. The line didn't hit him like a punch. It settled like a weight, not because it was loud, but because it was true. I saw what they said about you on TV. I watched them laugh when you stood by Trump, and I almost turned it off. But then you said something. You said, I'm proud to stand beside him. And for a split second, it didn't feel like politics. It felt like you were talking about people like my husband, like you remembered. So I'm writing this letter, not to change minds, but to thank you. Because when the microphones turned off, your words still echoed. They reminded me someone saw him. And that matters more than all their headlines. Thank you for saying it out loud. JD folded the letter slowly. His staff was still typing across the room, briefing folders still shuffled in the background. But the noise around him faded. He didn't file the letter. He didn't send a reply. He did what he'd done in East Palestine. Quietly, deliberately, he remembered. And for a brief moment, he realized something the polls never measured. One letter, 5 pages, could weigh more than 5 million views. The letter from the widow in West Virginia stayed folded in JD's coat pocket for days. He didn't talk about it, not even to his wife, but it shaped something invisible in him, a kind of clarity, not rage, not vindication, just a quiet refusal to be distracted again. So when the call came, it didn't take him long to decide. His aide, Josh, knocked on the office door with a hesitant look. It's from the Bellman show, he said, referencing the late-night host who'd mocked JD relentlessly after the Trump tweet went viral. They want you back on air. This time it's different, though. They say it's a serious sit-down, no audience, just conversation. JD didn't look up from the draft of a rural health care bill he was editing. Do they want to apologize? Josh paused. Not in so many words. They said they respect the resilience you've shown. They think people might want to hear your side of the story now, especially with the photo, the hearing clip, everything going viral. There was a beat of silence. JD finally glanced up, setting his pen down. So after the world laughed, now they're curious? Josh didn't answer. JD leaned back in his chair. Tell them no. Josh blinked. Are you sure? This could be. I'm sure, JD interrupted calmly. I'm not interested in being part of their redemption arc. He stood and walked to the window, where the Capitol dome loomed in its usual silent watch. Let the story speak louder than the segment. Josh hesitated. Should I at least say you appreciated the offer? JD turned, softening a bit. Tell them I hope they mean it, that they're not just chasing what's trending this week, but no, I won't be on their show. He picked up the widow's letter again, as if by instinct, and held it lightly. We spend too much time trying to explain ourselves to people who already decided what we are. I'm not doing that dance anymore. Josh nodded slowly, still digesting the moment. All right, I'll call them back. As the door closed behind him, JD exhaled deeply. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even bitter. He was just finished with the noise, finished with trying to win over a crowd that never cared to listen in the first place. On his desk, beneath the pile of draft policies and speaking invitations, lay a single framed copy of the photo from East Palestine, Trump, JD, and a crate of water, mid-lift, faces smeared with sweat and soot. Not a single camera in sight. It hadn't needed explanation then. It didn't need one now. For the first time in weeks, JD felt like he wasn't trying to prove something. He was just standing where he always had been. Only now, maybe, the world was finally catching up. And if they weren't, then at least one widow in West Virginia knew the truth, and that was enough. It had been 6 days since J.D. Vance turned down the Bellman interview. The headlines had already moved on. Washington had returned to its usual hum of noise, hearings, handshakes, sound bites. But in a modest studio tucked into the back of a community center in southern Ohio, J.D. sat alone at a wooden desk with no handlers, no prepared questions, and no teleprompter. Just a microphone. Just truth. He leaned in, pressed record, and spoke with the kind of stillness that comes only when a man has run out of patience for pretending. No script tonight, he began quietly. No guess. Just me, and maybe you. If you've stayed long enough to listen. A pause, then the voice found itself. By now, most of you have seen the clip, or the tweet, or the photo. You've heard the jokes. You've seen the headlines. He let out a slow breath, almost a laugh. You probably know what I said, but you may not know why I said it. He went on, not defensively, but deliberately, threading memory into message, dignity into declaration. I stood in the mud in East Palestine with a man the media decided they'd rather erase than understand. We didn't show up for applause. There was no press release, no podium, just people in pain and water to carry. He reached into his coat pocket and unfolded the widow's letter, though listeners couldn't see it. There's a woman in West Virginia who lost her husband. He served this country longer than most of us have held jobs. His last month on earth was made better by a policy they told you to laugh at. His voice didn't rise. It just steadied. You don't have to like who I stand next to. You don't have to vote how I vote. But if standing in the mud for my people is mockery to them, his voice slowed, softened, then let them laugh. He paused. I'll be busy remembering. J.D. sat for a moment after he finished, letting the silence breathe. No edits, no outro music, just the quiet click of him stopping the recording. Across the country, the episode uploaded without promotion, no flashy title. Just Episode 1, What They Forgot. By the end of the night, it had 1,000 plays. By the next morning, 10,000. By the weekend, 3 million. But J.D. wasn't counting. He didn't watch the trending bar. He didn't refresh the analytics. Because for once, the point wasn't to be heard by everyone. The point was to say something worth hearing by anyone. And this time, it wasn't a campaign. It wasn't a defense. It was memory spoken out loud. The folding chairs were filled long before J.D. arrived. No signs, no network vans, no red carpets rolled over cracked pavement. It had been a full year since that muddy day went viral, and 10 months since his podcast had quietly, stubbornly, and relentlessly climbed into the headphones of every forgotten corner of the country. It was never meant to go viral, but it did, not because it was loud, but because it was real. And now, as J.D. stepped into the town hall in East Palestine, wearing no tie, no lapel pin, no prepared notes, he felt something he hadn't felt since the hearing: stillness. But this time, it wasn't the silence of being ignored. It was the silence of people waiting to listen. He scanned the room. At least 200 folding chairs. Everyone occupied. The walls lined with others who didn't mind standing. A group of farmers near the back nodded at him. A teenager leaned forward, phone off, hands clasped. And then he saw them. Half a dozen people, maybe more, wearing black t-shirts with one image printed in faded gray ink. The blurry photo of J.D. and Trump in the mud, hauling water, no cameras in sight. The photo that no network aired, that no newspaper ran, that no satirical monologue dared to show. J.D. smiled, not out of pride, but out of recognition. In the third row, a woman stood up without being called on. "We don't need a speech," she said, loud enough to carry. "We just need to say something to you." J.D. nodded, silently inviting her forward. She continued, "People said it was about politics, about loyalty, about Trump." Her voice didn't shake. But it wasn't. It was about who didn't forget us when we were knee-deep in it. A quiet murmur of agreement rippled across the crowd. She held up her phone, not to record, but to show the lock screen. It was the same muddy photo. Every time the news says nothing's changed, she said, I look at this, and I remember that somebody showed up. Not to talk, just to carry. JD swallowed hard. No media outlet could have written that line better. No campaign slogan could have earned it. And he realized he didn't need a microphone anymore. Not here. He stepped forward slowly. I don't know how to thank you, he said, his voice low but clear. I came back because I never forgot. I didn't expect to find out. That neither did you. No thunderous applause, just nods, a few teary eyes, a long, silent standing ovation that didn't need volume to carry weight. There were no headlines the next day, no trending clips. But something else stayed behind, a shared memory, and a message passed, not posted. And this time, it wasn't JD's photo that mattered, it was who carried it. The photo wasn't printed on glossy paper. JD had it developed the old way, matte finish, soft texture, slight grain. You could almost feel the cold in the mud, the worn denim, the plastic of the water jugs, and the silence that spoke more than any news anchor ever had. Back in his Senate office, surrounded by polished mahogany and neutral tones, the image stood out like a scar on polished skin. He chose a frame of untreated oak, sturdy, raw, like the boots they wore that day. No gold trim, no glass to gloss it over, just wood, just truth. He mounted it himself, declined the aide's offer, said it needed to be done by hand. As he drove in the final nail, his fingers smudged the lower corner, a faint streak of dirt. He didn't wipe it off. Beneath the photo, he had a plaque installed, hand-carved, not laser-etched, just 4 words. You don't need a camera to lead, you just need boots. It wasn't meant to be clever. It was meant to be remembered. JD stepped back, eyes fixed on the wall. In a room lined with degrees, donor plaques, and framed headlines, this one felt like the only honest thing in sight. That day in East Palestine had never been on his calendar. Neither had the town hall, neither had the letter from the widow, but they stayed with him far longer than any televised debate or party fundraiser ever had. He didn't take a photo of the wall, didn't post it, didn't send it to a journalist. He just sat. Sometimes visitors would notice it. Some didn't ask. Some nodded quietly. One staffer stood frozen for a full minute before whispering, I forgot it was that bad. JD simply replied, most people did. That's why I didn't. The quote beneath the frame wasn't for others. It was for him, a reminder of where the noise stopped and where the work began. Because legacy, he had learned, isn't a speech or a stage. It's what stays behind when the headlines move on. And sometimes it hangs on a wall, not to impress, but to remind. That leading didn't mean talking louder. It meant showing up, even when no one was watching. The office lights dimmed behind him as JD stepped into the evening air. No cameras followed, no staffers trailed. Just his own footsteps echoing against the stone sidewalk, carrying him through the city that never quite felt like home. Capitol Hill at dusk was always a strange place, half proud, half forgotten. Like the echo of a voice no one wanted to remember but couldn't quite erase. He carried no briefcase, just a folded piece of mail in his coat pocket, another letter from another town that didn't trend. Inside was a single line, you didn't save us, you stood with us. That was enough. Street lamps flickered on. The hum of distant traffic faded into quiet. Somewhere behind a shuttered bakery, a dog barked once, then fell silent. And then from the other side of the street, the sound of a bicycle's rattle. A kid, no older than 12, sped past him with reckless confidence only youth allows. As he passed JD, the boy turned and shouted, "Thanks for saying it out loud." No follow-up, no explanation. Just that. JD slowed for a moment, blinked, then let the faintest smile slip across his face. He didn't know what the kid had heard. Maybe the town hall clip, maybe the podcast, maybe nothing at all. But somehow he'd heard enough. And in that moment, JD didn't feel like a politician. He felt like someone who had told the truth when it wasn't easy. And somehow, somewhere, it had stayed with someone. He reached the gate to his street, paused, and looked back. Not toward the Capitol, but toward the shadows behind him. Then came the voiceover. Low even and final. Loyalty isn't loud. It's what remains when the noise dies down. And with that, JD walked the last 100 steps home, without applause, without fanfare. Just a man, the mud still in memory, and silence finally on his side. Sometimes the most powerful statements aren't made behind podiums, but in muddy boots and quiet choices. J.D. Vance's journey wasn't about defending a politician. It was about standing in the spaces most people had forgotten. In a world obsessed with noise, he chose memory. In a moment of ridicule, he chose to return, not to argue, but to remind. This story asks us something deeper. When loyalty is mocked and truth is inconvenient, will we still carry it forward? What's one moment in your life when doing the quiet, right thing mattered more than being understood? If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.